My 8-year-old stepson stood up at my promotion party and said, "My mom says you only got this job by sleeping with the boss." The conference room went silent in that horrible way where you can hear the air conditioning hum. 50 people from my company stood frozen with champagne glasses halfway to their mouths. My boss Daniel was mid-sentence about my 5 years of dedicated service when Oliver interrupted him. My stepson's voice carried across the entire room because children's voices always do when they're saying something that will destroy your life. He stood on his chair in his little button-up shirt that I'd ironed that morning, pointing at me with one hand and at Daniel with the other. My husband Greg grabbed Oliver and pulled him down, his face going white, but the damage was already done. Daniel's wife Rebecca turned to look at me with her mouth open. The VP of Operations set down his drink so hard it splashed. I watched my entire career collapse in real time as people started whispering and pulling out their phones. Oliver looked confused about why everyone was staring, and Greg was trying to cover his mouth, but my stepson kept talking through his father's fingers, saying his mom told him it was important that everyone knew the truth about me. I'd been with Greg for 3 years, married for 8 months. His ex-wife Vanessa had made it clear from day one that she hated me for existing. Greg left her 2 years before we met, but she acted like I'd personally destroyed their marriage. Every custody exchange became an opportunity for her to make comments about how I wasn't Oliver's real mother, how I'd never understand what it meant to sacrifice for a child, how convenient it was that I swooped in after she'd done all the hard work of raising him through his difficult years. I'd tried everything to win her over, or at least establish a peaceful coexistence. I sent her Mother's Day cards to acknowledge her role in Oliver's life. I made sure Oliver called her every night when he was with us. I never tried to replace her or compete with her. But Vanessa saw every kind gesture as an insult and every boundary as a declaration of war. She told Oliver I was trying to steal his daddy, that I was pretending to like him to trick his father into loving me more, that she was his only real family and everyone else was temporary. Daniel cleared his throat and suggested we take a short break, his voice too professional and controlled. People scattered toward the hallway in clusters, and I could see them already typing on their phones, probably messaging the entire company about what they'd just witnessed. Rebecca left without looking at me again. Greg was apologizing to Daniel while trying to explain to Oliver why what he'd said was wrong, but Oliver just looked scared and confused. I stood there unable to move, feeling like my skin was crawling with invisible insects. I'd worked 60-hour weeks for 5 years to earn this senior director position. I'd brought in 3 major clients that generated millions in revenue. I'd mentored junior staff and redesigned our entire project management system. And now 50 people thought I'd fucked my way to the top. Daniel told Greg to take Oliver home, his voice cold and distant, and said he'd call me tomorrow to discuss next steps. The phrase next steps made my stomach drop because it sounded like HR language for an investigation. Greg drove Oliver home while I stayed to help clean up the conference room that suddenly felt like a crime scene. My assistant Jennifer kept giving me these pitying looks while we threw away plates of untouched cake. She asked if I wanted to talk about it, and I said no because what was there to say? A child had just accused me of sexual misconduct in front of my entire professional network. My promotion that I'd earned through years of exhausting work was now permanently tainted. Even if the company investigated and cleared me, everyone would always wonder if it was true. Jennifer hugged me before she left and whispered that she knew it was bullshit, that she'd worked with me long enough to know I'd earned everything through talent and dedication. I appreciated her loyalty, but I also knew she was probably the only person in that room who believed me. I drove home in a daze, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white, playing the scene over and over in my head and trying to figure out how Vanessa had convinced an 8-year-old child to destroy my career. Greg was waiting in our living room when I got home, looking like he'd aged 10 years. Oliver was in his bedroom, probably scared about the chaos he'd caused without understanding it. Greg said he'd talked to Vanessa, and she'd claimed she never said anything like that to Oliver, that he must have overheard adults talking and misunderstood. I laughed at that because it was such obvious bullshit. Oliver had repeated her words verbatim, in the cadence and phrasing of an adult, not a child's misunderstanding. Greg admitted he didn't believe her either, but he didn't know what to do because we couldn't prove she'd coached Oliver to say it. He'd asked Oliver directly where he'd heard it, and Oliver said Mommy told him last week that it was important for Daddy to know the truth about me, that I was a bad person who tricked people to get what I wanted. Greg's hands were shaking as he told me this, and I could see he was torn between defending me and protecting his son from being caught in the middle of adult warfare. I called my lawyer friend Monica at 9 that night, sitting in my car in our driveway because I didn't want Oliver to hear. Monica specialized in employment law and had warned me years ago about the dangers of workplace relationships, even though I'd never had one. She listened to the whole story and then was quiet for a long time before telling me I needed to request a formal investigation immediately, that waiting would make me look guilty. She explained that the company had to take Oliver's accusation seriously because it was a sexual harassment allegation, even coming from a child. They'd interview witnesses, review my work history, examine my interactions with Daniel, probably question Daniel's wife about their marriage. The investigation could take weeks or months, and during that time, I'd be under scrutiny with my reputation destroyed regardless of the outcome. Monica said I also needed to document everything related to Vanessa's harassment, because if this was part of a pattern, it might be relevant to custody arrangements. I sat in my car for an hour after we hung up, watching the house lights and trying to process that my ex-husband's vindictive ex-wife had just weaponized an 8-year-old child to commit career assassination. The next morning, Daniel called me into his office before I'd even taken off my coat. His assistant Karen wouldn't make eye contact with me in the hallway. Daniel sat behind his desk in that careful, neutral position people use when they're about to ruin your life professionally. He said he'd spoken with HR and legal, and they needed to put me on administrative leave pending an investigation into Oliver's allegations. I started to defend myself, but he held up his hand and said this wasn't personal, it was protocol. The company had to take all harassment claims seriously, and because the accusation involved him specifically, an outside firm would conduct the investigation to avoid any appearance of bias. He assured me this was standard procedure and didn't mean they believed the allegations, but his voice said otherwise. I asked how long the investigation would take, and he said probably 3 to 4 weeks. I was to have no contact with him outside of the investigation, no access to company systems, and I'd continue receiving my salary, but the promotion was on hold until this was resolved. I left his office and packed up my desk while people pretended not to watch me, feeling like a criminal being perp-walked out of my own career. Vanessa called me directly that afternoon, which she'd never done in 3 years. Her voice was sweet and fake when she said she'd heard about the unfortunate incident at my party. She claimed she was just as shocked as everyone else that Oliver would say something so inappropriate, that children sometimes make up stories for attention. I told her I knew she'd coached him to say it, and she laughed and asked if I had any proof of that accusation. She said it sounded like I was having a breakdown and maybe projecting my workplace stress onto innocent people. Then her voice got colder and she said this whole situation could have been avoided if I'd just stayed away from her family, that I'd inserted myself into their lives and now I was dealing with the consequences. She hung up before I could respond, and I sat there staring at my phone, understanding that this was never about Oliver or Greg. This was Vanessa's calculated revenge for me daring to love the man she'd lost, and she'd just proved she was willing to use her own son as a weapon to hurt me. The investigation started 3 days later with a call from an investigator named Ruth Calloway from an outside firm. She had a professional, detached voice that made it clear she'd done hundreds of these cases. We met at a coffee shop because I couldn't go to the office, and she recorded our entire conversation. She asked about my relationship with Daniel, my work history, how I'd gotten each promotion, whether Daniel and I had ever been alone together outside of work. I explained that Daniel was my boss, but we'd never had an inappropriate relationship, that every promotion I'd received was merit-based and documented, that his wife Rebecca had been at countless company events where I'd interacted with Daniel professionally. Ruth asked about the promotion party and what Oliver had said. I told her the exact words and explained about Vanessa's ongoing campaign to sabotage my relationship with Greg and Oliver. Ruth wrote everything down without changing expression, then asked if I had any evidence that Oliver had been coached. I said no, but that an 8-year-old doesn't spontaneously accuse someone of sexual misconduct in those specific terms without adult instruction. Greg and I barely spoke that week. Oliver was confused about why I wasn't going to work, and Greg told him I was taking a vacation. Vanessa had extra custody time that week, and I knew she was using it to reinforce whatever narrative she'd planted in Oliver's head. Greg tried to apologize, but I told him his ex-wife had just potentially ended my career, and I needed space to process that. He looked hurt and said he was a victim in this too, that Vanessa was punishing him by hurting me. I snapped back that he'd chosen to have a child with someone who turned out to be vindictive and unstable, and now I was paying for his poor judgment. The words came out meaner than I intended, but I was so angry I couldn't separate my feelings for Greg from my rage at Vanessa. He slept in the guest room that night, and I lay in our bed staring at the ceiling, realizing that Vanessa hadn't just attacked my career, but had found a way to damage my marriage at the same time. The investigator interviewed Daniel, Rebecca, my assistant Jennifer, and apparently half the company. People started avoiding me at the grocery store and the gym. Someone I barely knew from the marketing department posted something vague on social media about powerful women who claim feminism but use their sexuality to advance, and I knew she was talking about me. My own mother called asking what was going on because one of her friends had heard rumors. I tried to explain, but even my mother asked in this careful voice if there was any truth to it, if maybe Daniel had shown me special attention that I'd misinterpreted. I hung up on her. Monica called every few days to check on me and remind me that truth was on my side, but I was starting to understand that truth didn't matter when a child had made a public accusation that confirmed everyone's worst assumptions about professional women. Greg brought Oliver home after Vanessa's custody time, and my stepson wouldn't look at me. He went straight to his room and closed the door. Greg said Vanessa had told Oliver I was very angry with him for telling the truth, that I might try to punish him or turn his daddy against him. Greg had tried to explain that wasn't true, but Oliver was 8 and scared and didn't understand the adult complexity of what was happening. I knocked on Oliver's door and asked if I could come in. He said okay in this tiny voice, and I sat on his bed while he played with his toys. I told him I wasn't angry with him, that he was a kid and he'd just repeated what an adult told him. I asked him if he remembered exactly what his mom had said about me and my job. Oliver looked at me with those big eyes children have and said Mommy told him that some women get jobs by being pretty and nice to their bosses instead of working hard, and that I was one of those women. She'd said it was important for everyone to know so they didn't think I was actually good at my job. I recorded Oliver saying this on my phone, hands shaking because I needed evidence. Greg walked in and saw what I was doing and got angry, saying I couldn't record his son without permission. I told him I needed proof that Vanessa had coached Oliver, that without it, the investigation would conclude there was reasonable doubt about my innocence. Greg said using Oliver as evidence would make the custody situation worse, that Vanessa would claim we were manipulating him. I asked what he expected me to do, just let my career die to protect his ex-wife from consequences. We fought for 2 hours that night, both of us saying things we regretted, until Greg finally admitted he was scared of Vanessa getting full custody if we pushed back too hard. I realized then that Greg had been letting Vanessa get away with her behavior for years because he was terrified of losing his son, and I'd become collateral damage in their dysfunctional arrangement. Ruth called me back for a second interview 2 weeks into the investigation. She said they'd found no evidence of an inappropriate relationship between Daniel and me, that every witness confirmed our interactions had been professional, that my promotion was clearly merit-based according to performance reviews and revenue numbers. But she also said the investigation had identified a pattern of Vanessa making false allegations against me to other parents at Oliver's school, claiming I'd been neglectful or inappropriate with children. 3 mothers confirmed Vanessa had told them I was sleeping with my boss, using nearly identical phrasing. Ruth said this suggested Oliver had been coached, but without Oliver testifying about the coaching or Vanessa admitting to it, the company couldn't definitively prove the allegation was false. She explained that the investigation would likely conclude unsubstantiated, meaning they couldn't prove it happened, but also couldn't prove it didn't. I asked what that meant for my career, and Ruth said the promotion would probably go through, but my reputation was permanently damaged. I hired Monica officially that day and authorized her to pursue legal action against Vanessa for defamation and parental alienation. Monica filed paperwork requesting an emergency custody evaluation, citing Vanessa's pattern of making false allegations and using Oliver as a weapon in adult conflicts. The custody evaluator was a psychologist named Dr. Leonard Fisher, who specialized in high-conflict divorces. He interviewed Greg, Vanessa, Oliver, and me separately over 3 weeks. Greg told me Vanessa had been furious about the evaluation, claiming we were trying to take Oliver away from her because I couldn't handle being called out for my behavior. The night before my interview with Dr. Fisher, Vanessa sent me a series of text messages saying she'd destroy me before she let me have any influence over her son, that she knew powerful people who could make my career problems look minor compared to what she'd do next. I forwarded all the texts to Monica and Dr. Fisher. Dr. Fisher's office was full of children's toys and had that careful, neutral energy therapists cultivate. He asked me to explain the situation from my perspective, and I told him everything starting from when I'd met Greg. I showed him the text from Vanessa, explained the promotion party incident, described the investigation and its impact on my career. Dr. Fisher asked how Oliver behaved around me at home, whether I'd noticed changes after he spent time with Vanessa. I told him Oliver was affectionate and normal with me until about 6 months ago, when Vanessa started the parental alienation campaign. Now Oliver seemed confused and withdrawn, like he didn't know if he was allowed to love me. Dr. Fisher took notes without judgment, then asked if I'd ever considered that my presence in Oliver's life might be causing him stress regardless of Vanessa's behavior. The question made me defensive, but I forced myself to consider it honestly. I said yes, I'd thought about that constantly, but removing myself wouldn't help Oliver learn healthy relationship patterns or protect him from having a mother who weaponized him against other adults. The investigation concluded 4 weeks after it started with a formal letter stating the allegations were unsubstantiated. The company found no evidence of sexual misconduct between Daniel and me, confirmed my promotion was merit-based, and reinstated me to the senior director position effective immediately. But the letter also noted that the investigation had created workplace disruption and recommended I undergo professional coaching to rebuild team trust. I read that part 3 times, feeling sick, because it essentially blamed me for being falsely accused. Daniel called to say he was glad this was resolved but suggested I might want to consider transferring to our Austin office to start fresh. I told him I'd worked in this office for 5 years and built my reputation here, and I wasn't going to run away because his wife was uncomfortable. He said Rebecca had been struggling with the investigation and the rumors, that she needed space to process everything. I reminded him that I was the victim here, not Rebecca, and if anyone needed to transfer offices, maybe it should be him, so I didn't have to work for a boss who treated me like I'd done something wrong. Vanessa posted on social media that night about corrupt corporate investigations that protect powerful people, not naming me but making it obvious. 30 people shared it. I filed for a restraining order based on her threatening texts and pattern of harassment. The judge granted a temporary order and scheduled a hearing in 3 weeks. Greg was furious because it meant Vanessa couldn't come to our house for custody exchanges, complicating the logistics of Oliver's schedule. I told him I didn't care about logistics, that his ex-wife had tried to destroy my career and was now publicly defaming me. Greg said I was escalating things unnecessarily, that Vanessa was just acting out because she felt threatened by the custody evaluation. I asked him when he planned to start protecting me instead of making excuses for her, and he said he was trying to protect Oliver from being caught in the middle. I said Oliver was already in the middle, that Vanessa had put him there when she coached him to make false accusations, and Greg's refusal to hold her accountable was making everything worse. Dr. Fisher's custody evaluation report came out 6 weeks after his first interview. It was 30 pages long and methodically detailed Vanessa's pattern of parental alienation, false allegations, and using Oliver as a vehicle for revenge against Greg and me. He noted that Oliver showed signs of anxiety and confusion about his relationships with his father and me, consistent with a child being coached to reject a step-parent. He documented Vanessa's threatening texts, the promotion party incident, her social media posts, and interviews with Oliver's teachers who confirmed Vanessa had been making false allegations about me to other parents. His recommendation was that Greg receive primary custody with Vanessa getting supervised visitation until she completed parenting classes and therapy focused on co-parenting and boundaries. The report concluded that Vanessa's behavior posed a risk to Oliver's emotional well-being and that her access to him needed to be limited until she demonstrated she could prioritize his needs over her own anger. Vanessa's lawyer fought the custody change with everything they had, filing motions claiming the evaluation was biased, that Dr. Fisher had been influenced by our money and connections. The custody hearing lasted 3 full days with both sides presenting witnesses and evidence. Vanessa testified that I'd systematically tried to replace her in Oliver's life, that Greg had abandoned their family for me, that everything she'd done was to protect her son from my negative influence. Her lawyer showed photos of me and Oliver together and suggested I was trying to erase Vanessa from his memory. Monica destroyed that argument by presenting Oliver's own words about his mother coaching him to make false allegations, the text from Vanessa threatening me, and testimony from 3 mothers at Oliver's school about Vanessa's campaign to damage my reputation. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Patricia Ruiz, who listened to everything with an increasingly stern expression. Judge Ruiz issued her ruling from the bench at the end of the 3rd day. She said she'd reviewed all the evidence and found Dr. Fisher's evaluation to be thorough and credible. She stated that Vanessa had engaged in a deliberate pattern of parental alienation and had weaponized Oliver against his father and stepmother in ways that were psychologically harmful to the child. She granted Greg primary custody and gave Vanessa supervised visitation every other weekend and 1 evening per week, pending completion of a parenting course and 6 months of therapy. She also granted the restraining order I'd requested and added provisions that Vanessa was prohibited from making any public statements about me or discussing me with Oliver except in neutral terms. Vanessa started crying and yelling that the system was rigged, that rich people could buy custody, that I'd stolen her family. Judge Ruiz warned her that continued outbursts would result in contempt charges. Vanessa's lawyer had to physically restrain her as we left the courtroom. The hardest part was explaining everything to Oliver in age-appropriate terms. Greg and I sat him down together and told him he'd be living with us most of the time now, that he'd still see his mom regularly, but things would be different for a while. Oliver cried and asked if it was his fault, if he'd gotten his mom in trouble by telling the truth at my party. I held him and said none of this was his fault, that adults had made bad choices and he'd just gotten caught in the middle. Greg explained that Mommy had been very sad and angry about the divorce, and sometimes when adults are hurting, they make mistakes that affect their kids. We told Oliver that everyone still loved him, that we'd always make sure he was safe and cared for, but that grown-ups needed to handle grown-up problems without involving him. Oliver asked if I was really bad at my job, and I told him no, that I'd worked very hard for many years to be good at what I do, and that sometimes people say untrue things when they're angry. He hugged me and whispered that he was sorry, and I told him he had nothing to be sorry for. Returning to work felt like walking back into a crime scene. People were professional, but distant. Rebecca transferred to our Boston office without speaking to me. Daniel and I had an awkward meeting where he apologized for suggesting I transfer and said he hoped we could rebuild our professional relationship. I told him I'd do my job to the highest standard as always, but I'd never forget how quickly he'd assumed I was guilty instead of considering I might be the victim of a false accusation. The promotion came with a significant raise and a corner office, but it felt hollow. My assistant Jennifer organized a small celebration with the people who'd supported me through the investigation, maybe 15 people total out of a 100-person office. They gave me a card that said they were proud to work with me, and I cried in the bathroom afterward because I'd spent 5 years building relationships that had evaporated in 60 seconds based on a child's coach statement. Vanessa violated the restraining order 3 times in the first month, each time claiming she didn't understand the terms. The first violation was showing up at Oliver's school during my designated pickup time and telling the teachers I wasn't authorized to take him. The school called the police and Vanessa was arrested for the first time in her life. The second violation was creating a fake social media account to send me messages saying I'd pay for ruining her relationship with her son. Monica tracked the account to Vanessa's IP address. The third violation was posting my home address online with a caption implying I was a sexual predator. That one resulted in actual charges and a court date. Each violation meant Vanessa's supervised visitation was reduced further, which seemed to make her angrier and more reckless. Greg was constantly on the phone with lawyers and trying to explain to Oliver why Mommy kept doing things that got her in trouble. I watched my husband age in real time from the stress. Monica filed a civil defamation lawsuit against Vanessa seeking damages for career harm, emotional distress, and legal fees. The amount was substantial enough that Vanessa's lawyer actually advised her to settle. We sat in a mediation room with a neutral third party trying to negotiate terms. Vanessa looked terrible, like she hadn't slept in weeks, her hair unwashed and her clothes rumpled. Her lawyer did most of the talking, saying Vanessa was willing to issue a public apology and pay a settlement if we'd agree not to pursue the restraining order violations. Monica countered that Vanessa needed to post corrections on every social media platform where she'd made false statements, complete her therapy and parenting courses, and pay $200,000 in damages plus legal fees. Vanessa started crying and saying she didn't have that kind of money, that I was trying to destroy her financially the same way I destroyed her family. I looked at her across the table and felt nothing but exhaustion, wondering how we'd gotten to this point where a woman I'd never wanted to hurt had dedicated 3 years to trying to ruin my life. The settlement negotiations lasted 6 hours. Vanessa finally agreed to $90,000 paid over 3 years, public apologies and corrections, completion of all court-ordered programs, and strict adherence to the custody and restraining order terms. If she violated any provision, the full $200,000 would become due immediately. Monica drew up the papers, and Vanessa signed them with shaking hands, her lawyer probably threatening her with worse outcomes if she didn't comply. As we left the mediation office, Vanessa looked at me and said she hoped I was happy that I'd won. I told her this wasn't about winning, that I'd never wanted to be in competition with her, but she'd forced this situation by refusing to accept that Greg had moved on and built a new life. She said I'd never understand what it felt like to lose everything that mattered. I told her she hadn't lost anything except her own toxic behavior, and maybe one day she'd realize that. We left through separate exits, and I sat in my car for 20 minutes before I could drive, feeling drained and sad that this was how the story ended. Vanessa posted the required apologies and corrections that week, admitting she'd made false allegations against me, that she'd coached Oliver to repeat statements that weren't true, and that she'd engaged in a campaign to damage my reputation and career. The post stayed up for 30 days as required by the settlement. Several colleagues reached out to apologize for believing the rumors. Daniel's wife Rebecca even sent me an email saying she was sorry for not giving me the benefit of the doubt, that she'd been scared and reactive instead of rational. I appreciated the apologies but knew my reputation would never fully recover, that some people would always believe there was some truth to Vanessa's accusations regardless of the evidence. Monica reminded me that we'd gotten the best possible outcome, that Vanessa was being held accountable and Oliver was protected. I knew she was right, but it was hard to feel victorious when I'd lost so much in the process. Oliver adjusted slowly to the new custody arrangement, with good weeks and hard weeks. He completed some therapy of his own to process the divorce and everything that had happened. His therapist said he'd been experiencing loyalty conflicts, feeling like loving me meant betraying his mother. The supervised visitation supervisor reported that Vanessa was slowly learning to interact with Oliver without making negative comments about Greg or me, though she still struggled. Greg and I went to couples therapy to repair the damage Vanessa's campaign had caused to our marriage. Our therapist helped us understand that Greg's fear of Vanessa had allowed her to manipulate him for years, and that setting boundaries wasn't being cruel, but was actually better for everyone, including Oliver. We worked through my anger at feeling unsupported and his guilt about bringing someone so destructive into my life. 6 months after the custody hearing, we were starting to feel solid again. My career eventually recovered through sheer competence and time. I brought in 4 major clients in 12 months, exceeding my targets and proving my value beyond any doubt. The people who distanced themselves during the investigation gradually warmed up again, though some relationships never fully repaired. I got promoted to VP 2 years later, this time with no drama and genuine celebration. Daniel retired, and I reported to a new boss who knew my history, but judged me only on my results. The corner office felt like it actually meant something this time, earned twice over through both achievement and survival. I'd learned that professional reputation could be destroyed in seconds by false accusations, but it could also be rebuilt through consistent integrity and work that spoke for itself. Oliver turned 11 3 years after the promotion party incident. We celebrated at our house with his friends from school, and Vanessa came for an hour of unsupervised visitation, which she'd earned through 18 months of therapy and perfect compliance with all court orders. She was quieter now, medicated for anxiety and depression, working a steady job and living in a small apartment across town. She brought Oliver a thoughtful gift and sat on our porch talking to him about school, while Greg and I stayed inside, giving them space but remaining available. When it was time for her to leave, she hugged Oliver and told him she loved him without adding any poison about us. Progress. As she walked to her car, she turned back and said thank you for not completely cutting her off, and I nodded because I understood that the harshest punishment would have been losing Oliver entirely. She'd come close, closer than she probably realized, and maybe that fear had finally broken through her anger enough to create change. 6 years after Oliver's statement destroyed my promotion party, I sat in my VP office reviewing quarterly results while my husband brought me lunch. Oliver was 14 and mostly normal, doing well in school and playing soccer, with the kind of relationship with his mother that would probably always be complicated but was functional. Vanessa had met someone new and seemed focused on building her own life instead of destroying mine. The senior director who'd avoided me during the investigation was now my direct report. Daniel occasionally sent cards on holidays, having recognized too late that he should have protected me better. My career had exceeded everything I'd hoped for that night when I'd worked late preparing for my promotion, back when I'd thought the hardest part was already behind me. I learned that you can survive false accusations, that truth eventually matters even when it takes time, and that the people who matter stick around when everyone else disappears. The cost had been enormous, but I was still standing. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.